Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, another conversation about the Israel-Palestine conflict that's going on. As I said in the last episode, really trying to focus on the humanity of the situation, not trying to take sides and win political points and all of these things. And so I really hope that people can hear that from my guests that come on and talk about this. Very, very happy, very, very pleased to bring the conversation I had with Yardena Schwartz. She's an award-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated producer. She lived in Israel for about 10 years, and she reported for pretty much feels like everywhere: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Economist, etc. She's been all over the world with her reporting: Morocco, Ukraine, Poland, France. She's worked at NBC News. She's done it all, right? She has, I believe, a degree from Columbia Journalism School. She's been Emmy-nominated. She's done all the things. And she is the author of the wonderful book called Ghosts of a Holy War, which I believe is her first book. And in that, she talks about the 1929 Jewish Massacre in Hebron. And that's what we talk about. Really interesting because in the book, she obviously uses that sort of as a starting point, but then gives a really, really nice history of how things have transpired over the 20th century. And as she discusses in the conversation, seeing a lot of themes, kind of direct links to October 7th. So we talk about all of that. We start by giving an overview of the 1929 Hebron Massacre. We discuss a bit of the Ottoman and British rule of Palestine up to that point. We talked about Hebron itself and some of the holy sites in Palestine, both for Jews and Muslims. We talk about this aspect of a independent Palestine, how that's become something that has been discussed over the 20th century. Motivations and propaganda before the 1929 massacre. We talk about Haj Amin, who he was, and then we talk about the lineage of him to present-day Palestinian leadership. We talk about October 7th and many other topics. Again, Yardena is a wonderful person. She really tries to see the humanity of people. In her book, she, interviews and talks with Palestinians. Obviously, talks with Jewish folks, and she has a really, really nice temperament. And I think her shining a light on the 1929 massacre and looking at some of similar themes that transpire is super important. And again, my goal in this conversation with her, which she was so kind and so pleasant and so knowledgeable on, was to really just try and present some of the information there, ask good questions, see the humanity, and try to understand how some of that conflict over there can cease. So it's complicated. These issues aren't complicated. She gets that. I tried my best to get that. So I hope listeners understand that as well. So, but again, big joy to have her. She was quite pleasant, and I hope everyone reads her book. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, all the good things. Really appreciate it. And now I bring you Yardena Schwartz. I am here with Yardena Schwartz. Yardena, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks so much, Javier. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big pleasure. So you have a new book coming out, or it's out, actually, I should say, and the audio book is coming out very soon. So that's all wonderful. The book is Ghosts of a Holy War: The 1929 Massacre in Palestine That Ignited the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and it's a fabulous book. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, just give listeners, I guess, a bit of like a snapshot of who you are professionally and what you're currently doing.
So I am an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer. Ghosts of the Holy War is my first book, and it's the product of 10 years of reporting from Israel and the West Bank. I started writing the book back in 2019 when I was still working as a freelance journalist based in Tel Aviv. I was reporting for dozens of publications like Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. But once I started writing this book, I really just dove deep into it and spent the next 5 years researching the 1929 massacre in Palestine and its reverberations today. And I was actually still writing the book and writing my manuscript. I was about 2/3 of the way through writing it when October 7th happened. And I was no longer living in Israel at the time. I had, over the course of writing this book, I got married and had 2 kids and decided to move back to the States, which is where I'm from, to be closer to my family, and had just moved to New York in July of 2023. So we were still getting settled into life here when we were, shocked, just like everyone was, by the attacks of October 7th. And those attacks really brought new meaning to the book I was writing. And really, we can talk about this later, of course, but really changed the trajectory of the book I was writing.
Yeah, I can imagine so. So COVID was a busy time for you. It sounds like you were writing a book during COVID. You got married, you had kids, you moved. Like, wow, it's a lot that happened during COVID, I guess, for you.
Yeah, and I actually got really lucky with COVID because I had started doing all of my reporting and interviews in Hebron before. Mm-hmm. So rather than start with the history, researching in archives and all of that, I decided, I'm going to start by just going to Hebron and speaking with Palestinians and Israelis living there. And I'm so glad I made that decision to start there because I managed to get done hundreds of hours of reporting in Hebron before Israel and the West Bank was essentially closed down. I mean, Israel had one of the most harsh lockdowns of anywhere in the world. Like we couldn't go 50 yards from our house. So I was really grateful that I had done all of that in-person reporting in Hebron before, because you can't do these kinds of interviews on Zoom.
Yeah,
and I was often
definitely
going
limit you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. That's again, timing is everything in some ways. Mm-hmm. So I did not know about this historical event. So again, it was all new for me. It was all historically it was very, very new. I guess you can talk about a bit, the evolution of it, but why did you decide to focus on a massacre that happened almost 100 years ago in Hebron as the kind of focal point between some of the interactions between Jews and Arabs or Muslims? And how did you make, as you started writing, and then obviously October 7th happened, how did you see a sort of linkage? Was it like, well, is there one? Is there not one? Are you kind of putting that into it? Like, how did you kind of start to see all of that kind of come out? So why did you start with this massacre, and then how did you link it to kind of more current events?
So I actually did not set out to write a book about the 1929 massacre in Hebron. What happened was, I had always dreamed of writing a book, but I sort of just hoped something would fall into my lap because I couldn't decide what I would write a book about. And that actually happened. I woke up on New Year's Day, January 2019, to an email from a mentor of mine, another author, who had just met this family in Memphis, Tennessee, who had discovered a box of letters in their attic that they didn't know existed until then, that was filled with hundreds of pages of letters written by their great uncle in the late 1920s from Hebron to Memphis. And he had this, they knew about this uncle. They knew that he had gone to what was then British Mandate Palestine to study at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva, so, a school for Jewish learning. He'd gone there in 1928 to study Torah and to eventually become a rabbi. And he was tragically murdered in this massacre. And they knew about the massacre, but they didn't know much about it. They didn't know that these letters existed or that they were sitting in their attic. And they took like 10 years to read them and digitize them and organize them. And finally, they archived them in Memphis, but realized they didn't want them to just sit in an archive room in Memphis. They wanted this story to be told because it held so many lessons for the reality we're living in today. And they were looking for an author who could take those letters and do something with them. And the author who they contacted, his name is Yossi Klein Halevi. He had already written several books and was already working on his next book, so he couldn't take it on, but he promised them he'd find another author. And he asked me, and I said yes. But how do you write a book? Because I had spent years writing long form stories and feature stories, but nothing to prepare me for writing, a 400-page book about 100 years of history. So, like I said, I didn't really set out to write a book or to trace this conflict to this century-old massacre, but it was through my research that I realized, wait a second, this is ground zero of this conflict. I mean, when I first read those letters, I didn't understand that. What I did understand was that Hebron today is the antithesis of the Hebron this young man, David Schoenberg, was describing in his letters, because his letters painted this vivid portrait of a serenely beautiful, peaceful city where Jews and Muslims had lived side by side for generations. And the Hebron I knew was a Hebron I had been to only once, and it was the opposite of that. And I set out to write a book about the transformation of Hebron from being, the cradle of the Jewish people. It is, the burial place of Abraham and the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people. And it's the second holiest city in Judaism after Jerusalem. And also one of the holiest cities for Muslims as well, who revere Abraham as, Abraham is the patriarch of also the Arab people, but in Islam, he's revered as a prophet. So, this holy city had transformed from this beacon of coexistence to really the epicenter of what is a holy war. And I set out to understand how that had happened. And over the course of my research, I realized that this massacre hadn't just transformed Hebron, but really Zionism and the conflict itself, and tells us pretty much everything we need to know about how we got to this tragic moment and how we could find a way out of it.
Can you give us the kind of the bird's eye view here, kind of the overview of what happened in August of 1929? Where you talk about many Jewish men, women, and children were, raped, stabbed, tortured, killed. This is a horrific massacre. And, we can get into more of the specific details later, but yeah, kind of give us the overview of what happened.
So in late August of 1929, a year-long campaign of disinformation and propaganda against the Jewish community of Palestine reached a climax, and that climax was the Arab riots of 1929, which began in Jerusalem on August 23rd, 1929, but reached their peak the next day in Hebron, where 3,000 Muslim men armed with swords, axes, and daggers marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron and proceeded to go to every Jewish home and slaughter those inside, whether they were men, women, or children, elderly. And just as we saw on October 7th, women and teenage girls were raped, infants were slaughtered in their mother's arms, children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors, rabbis were castrated and yeshiva students as well. And homes were burnt down. Every synagogue in Hebron was looted and destroyed. And the British police force, since the British ruled Palestine at the time, the British police force in Hebron did nothing to stop it. Only when the crowd turned on the British police chief did he finally fire his weapon and the crowds dispersed. But for the 2 hours prior to that happening, they had wreaked havoc on this ancient Jewish community. And within just a few hours, 67 unarmed men, women, and children had been killed and dozens more wounded. And among the dead were several children under the age of 5. And across Palestine, in every Jewish community, the riots had reached every Jewish community, and many of the Jewish communities in Palestine were evacuated at the time, including the Jewish community of Gaza. But there were many communities where the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force, was active and organized, and they were able to repel the attacks. But in Hebron, because it had been this beacon of coexistence, the Jewish community and its leaders didn't think that anything would happen to them. They thought that, if riots were to break out, as they had been warned, they wouldn't affect Hebron because the relations between the Jews and the Arabs were so harmonious, or so they thought. And so the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the nucleus of the IDF, when several of its members visited Hebron 2 days before the riots erupted, they were told to leave. They said, the Jewish leaders of Hebron said, our Arab neighbors are our friends. They're going to protect us. Nothing will happen to us here. If anything, the presence of armed foreign men foreign Jews from another town would only awaken their suspicion, and it could then cause a riot. So they told them to leave. And in the end, it was the Jews of Hebron who paid the heaviest price in this week-long riot, which hit every part of Jewish Palestine. Yet it was Hebron where they suffered the most casualties and the most brutality. So 133 Jews were murdered that week, and more than 400 were wounded. But in Hebron, there were 67 of those casualties. So more than half of the casualties were in Hebron. This very small community. I mean, it was only 800 Jews living in Hebron at the time amongst 20,000 Muslims. And 3,000 of those Muslims participated in the massacre, including Arab policemen, because of the 40 policemen in Hebron at the time, just one was Jewish. And the Arab policemen either took an active part in the riots, or they stood by and stood guard outside of Jewish homes while the mobs, carried out their atrocities inside those homes.
So, I mean, it's a tragic story, obviously, and some people may be listening thinking like, well, what was the lead up to this? How did this happen? So very, very well. I mean, obviously you're a great writer, but you cover a lot of history in a really nice, concise way. So again, just very broadly here, because I think it's important contextually, historically. There's you kind of look to it and mention it, but there was a long history. So people in the modern time understand the area of Palestine and now Israel, but there was the Ottoman Empire controlled Palestine until the Balfour Declaration and gave control to Great Britain and Palestine. So the Ottomans ruled for 600 years up until World War I. Again, not all of that region, but they were the empire at the time. And so you get to this Balfour Declaration, and so you talk about how a lot of people have read the Bible or the Old Testament or things like that, and so know some idea about Jewish people living in Israel, many of these places, Judea, Samaria, things like that, during biblical times. But then there was Muslim rule for 1,000 years, more or less. So then this whole area has, kind of flip-flopped back and forth, and, sometimes for very long periods. Of course, 1,000 years is a long time. But I guess post-Ottoman, the British take control. There's the Balfour Declaration. You can kind of just mention that. But what kind of started to change? Because Jews hadn't lived here, or I should say they didn't control it like they do now. It was under Muslim rule. The Ottoman Empire was Muslim majority. And then the British take over, and they after this declaration, and then we start to see this kind of genesis of sorts, I guess, of the kibbutz, and during this whole period. So yeah, take us up to kind of that period, which kind of leads us right before the 20s of what's going on with historically how it was, and then how it started to evolve and change.
Yeah, it's a very, very long history of a rotating cast of foreign powers ruling over what had been renamed Palestine. Palestine was actually the name given by the Roman conquerors of the land of Judea, from which the name Judaism is derived. So the Jewish people are native to the land of Judea. After the Jewish rebellion against the Roman conquerors, that land was renamed by the Emperor Hadrian, Palestina. And of course, like you mentioned, it wasn't just the Romans who had conquered this territory, the Greeks, the Crusaders, and then, of course, the Muslim conquest, which lasted about 1,000 years. And when the Ottoman Empire fell with the end of World War I, Great Britain and France and all of these other foreign powers carved up different parts of the Middle East that had until then been ruled by the Ottomans and other powers. And so, the British Mandate of Palestine began officially in 1922 when the League of Nations gave Britain, on behalf of the international community, the right to govern over Palestine with the goal of eventually giving self-governance to its people. And baked into that mandate was the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when Lord Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, promised that the Zionist movement would be able to establish a home for the Jewish people in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, to provide them a safe haven from rising anti-Semitism that was punctuated by increasingly frequent pogroms throughout Eastern Europe, which were already sending Eastern European Jews to Palestine even before the British came to power in Palestine. So under the Ottoman Empire was actually when the first kibbutzim were established, not under the British. So there were waves of Jewish immigration under the Ottomans, and the Ottomans had actually enacted strict quotas on Jewish immigration. They didn't want too many Jews to come to Palestine. It was Muslim rule. The Jewish subjects under Muslim rule were treated as second-class citizens. They had to pay special taxes, not just in Palestine, but in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And the British rule over Palestine ended those systems. So, the special taxes on the Jewish community of Palestine ended. Those restrictions on Jewish immigration ended. And so now you saw many more Jews fleeing Eastern Europe for Palestine. This is, decades before the Holocaust, of course. And that increased Jewish immation led to a backlash among the Arab leadership, not so much among the Arab population at first. The Arab population didn't really rise up against that Jewish immigration. It was their leaders who were warning them of, the impact of Jewish immigration, and the words they used were really similar. If you listen to the anti-immigrant rhetoric of politicians today, it sounds just like that. I mean, the Arab leadership was saying, these people, these foreigners are bringing foreign principles into our lives. The Arab community in Palestine was extremely patriarchal. I mean, women wore full body coverings. Women certainly did not go to school. They didn't work. And many of the European immigrants from the Jewish community in Europe were bringing with them, ideas of equality among the sexes. The women didn't cover their bodies. They wore, pants and short sleeves, and they worked in the fields and agriculture. And for a very traditional patriarchal society, that was really threatening to them. And they saw that as a really detrimental influence to their way of life. And so it was easy to rile up fear of this rising Jewish immigration. But once religion came into that fear, then it really took hold. And so what happened in 1929 was the direct result of this fear-mongering that was led by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. His name was Haj Amin al-Husseini. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So the most powerful Muslim leader in the land, basically the equivalent of, the Jewish equivalent would be the chief rabbi of Palestine. So the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was the most powerful Arab leader in the land, and he started this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were planning to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple in Jerusalem. And that was when the animosity against the Zionist movement, that's when it really went into full speed, because the fear of immigration wasn't as effective for him and other Arab leaders. But once they added the weaponization of Islam and the supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the holiest Muslim site in Palestine, or what is today Israel, then they were able to get the masses to really rise up against Jewish immigration and against the local Jewish community in Palestine.
Yeah, I'll come to him in a minute, because I learned quite a few things about him in the book, which were pretty alarming. So I do want to take some time there. But one question here, just to kind of, because we can talk about a little bit more in the details of the events, is there are a handful of very special and holy places, so that you mentioned. So we can start with Hebron. That's a holy city for the Jewish people. You mentioned earlier the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. There's also in Jerusalem, right, the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. And Muslims now are the only ones that can be inside. That's why the Jews are on the outside. There's obviously the Temple Mount, which is there. There's all of these places that have important religious and cultural and historical significance to Jewish people and to Muslims in the region. How much of this is animating a lot of the rhetoric and the actions that take place, where people are going to, in some cases, commit horrible acts, or they're going to die, or they're going to make a sacrifice? I mean, is it overstating it that these places are very, very, very holy and special and specific for both groups? If so, why? Or, is this more of just an artifact of kind of times past, and it has less significance, and that's just kind of overplayed, and people just use that to weaponize things? What do you make of this kind of dynamic?
I don't think you can overstate the significance that religion plays in this conflict, or the significance that Al-Aqsa Mosque specifically plays in animating this conflict. And I'll give a few examples. October 7th was named the Al-Aqsa Flood for a reason. Al-Aqsa is the single most galvanizing force in Palestinian society. There's a reason why Hamas's logo is the image of Al-Aqsa Mosque with a gun in front of it. There's a reason why the Grand Mufti back in 1928 realized the power of this rumor that Jews were plotting to destroy it. And that rumor has withstood the test of time because it is so successful in distracting the Palestinian people from their leaders' own inability to extricate them from perpetual poverty. So in 1928, before the Grand Mufti started that rumor, he was dogged by very justified accusations of corruption, nepotism, misappropriation of religious funds, because in addition to being the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he also had a very powerful post as the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which oversaw all Islamic holy sites, Sharia courts, any Muslim institution was overseen by this Muslim society that he led. And he used these religious funds for his own purposes. He built several mansions with it. He built a hotel with these funds, and it was located on top of a Muslim cemetery. Ironically, the architects were Jewish, and they warned him that they had found an ancient Muslim cemetery beneath his future hotel, and he said, "Okay, just don't tell anyone." So after he started this rumor, and particularly after the massacre of 1929, the riots, all of that criticism against him and the corruption accusations, all of those disappeared because suddenly there was this much more important enemy to confront. And so their leader's own corruption didn't really matter anymore. And so you see that today, how Hamas has decimated Gaza. I mean, long before October 7th, living in Gaza, forget the siege that Israel and Egypt had placed on Gaza for a second. Of course, that also added to the people in Gaza's misery. But, those blockades, which were instituted by Israel and Egypt, were because this terrorist organization had taken over this piece of land that they shared borders with. So, of course, they're not going to allow those borders to be open, and they're going to make sure that weapons don't get in or out. But Hamas itself ruled Gaza with an iron fist and executed, tortured, imprisoned dissidents. Being gay or lesbian in Gaza was not an option if you wanted to live. Criticizing Hamas was not an option if you wanted to live. And so, all of that criticism that would be lodged against Hamas kind of fell to the background because the main enemy always had to be Israel, and Israel always had to be, the reason for all of our suffering, even if it was obviously Hamas's terrorism against Israel that had led Israel to, close its border with Gaza, and of course Egypt as well. But, in 1929, here's another example of the power of religion. In 1929 and on October 7th, the men who raped and murdered and slaughtered children, men and women, they were not shouting, free our land, and the blockade. In 1929 and on October 7th, they were cheering Allahu Akbar, God is great. They were praising Islam and glorifying Islam as they slaughtered men, women, and children. And, you just have to listen to what these people say themselves to understand what their goals are. They're not saying their goal is, peace and freedom. They're saying their goal is to liberate Islamic land. They see the land of Israel as sort of an abomination of Islam because this was Islamic land for 1,000 years, and now there is a Jewish entity ruling over a part of that land. And so this is also why you see the rejection throughout history of any kind of two-state solutions. In 2008 and 2000, when those negotiations overseen by the Americans ended with the Palestinian rejection of a two-state solution, that wasn't the first time we saw this. I mean, in 1937, it was the Grand Mufti who rejected a two-state solution from the British. And in 1947, when the UN voted to partition Palestine into an independent state for the Arabs and an independent state for the Jews, it was embraced by the Jewish leaders of Palestine, and not just rejected by the Arab leaders in Palestine, but by every Arab leader that was a part of the UN. Every Arab state voted against it. And the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders declared jihad immediately after that vote because they did not see any reason why this holy Islamic land should be shared with the Jewish people. And that rejection has animated this conflict ever since.
I guess what I'm trying to understand here, and maybe it's just a larger project of sorts, but you have people, we don't have to go back 600, 1,000 years, but you have Muslims and Jews in Hebron and in the land of Palestine at the time, living harmoniously together. Now, maybe it wasn't always, wonderful and, it was a bed of roses, but more or less, a more recent history in the early turn of the 20th century into the 10s and the 20s before it's given over to the British. As you mentioned, there's some harmony here. How did, I guess, that change, right? Like you can have a leader, and yes, maybe he has all these, this corruption. Maybe he's not as respectful to the faith as maybe some, he claims he is, or whatever. All these things. But I guess for people on the ground, like these are their neighbors, and they live side by side. And yes, they worship a little bit differently. why, how did that, it's one thing for someone to say, okay, these folks are our enemies. They've come here. They've infiltrated the land. We got to get them out of here. We got to wage jihad, whatever it is. But how is that so convincing to people that had lived like, this is my neighbor, like this is, these are people in my town, these are people in my neighborhood. How did that turn? Again, I'm not saying it was overnight, but I mean, again, it wasn't decades of this either. And so I guess I'm curious, and just a little bit of a setup here. You mentioned that Haj Amin, wanted this kind of independent Palestine. As you mentioned in the book, though, and we've talked about already, the Romans, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, Palestine, I guess you'd have to find a time when it was independent, right? Because it seems like there was always, as we said, there's a rotating kind of cast of characters kind of ruling the space. And again, that doesn't mean that, people can't have independence or sorts. I'm not saying that, but almost like a kind of return to this, or how do we get a return to independent Palestine? I guess all of these things, how did this animate the buildup? They usually talked about that kind of year or so in 28 and to 29 of these tensions between Jewish folks and Muslims in Hebron, and then as it kind of spills out, how did that kind of arise?
I should say that on August 24th, 1929, there were 24 heroic Arab families in Hebron who rescued their Jewish neighbors from these attacks. So at least 200 Jewish lives were saved that day by their courageous Arab neighbors who risked their own lives to save their Jewish neighbors, whether it was by hiding them in their homes or standing guard outside these Jewish homes to keep the mobs away. So that's one thing. Not everyone fell to this disinformation campaign. Not everyone believed that their Jewish neighbors were their enemies. And I think it's really important to remember that, because I really do think that the Palestinian people are victims of their own corrupt leaders whose interests lie in perpetuating this conflict. I heard this from many Palestinians that I interviewed. They didn't want me to use their names or quote me, quote them saying this, but they said that they think the reason why peace has always been rejected by Arab leaders is not just for the religious reasons, but because once they actually have a state, then they'll have to do the much more difficult job of leading that state and governing that state. Whereas right now, for decades, they've been able to just change nothing and continue to receive billions of dollars in aid from the international community, which doesn't actually reach the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas have kept almost all of that money to themselves, without actually putting it into better infrastructure for their people or state building. Several Palestinians told me that they wish their leaders would do what the Zionist leadership did before there was a state of Israel. They didn't wait for a state to be given to them. I mean, the Balfour Declaration from the British was eventually thrown away. The British abandoned the Balfour Declaration and their commitment to a Jewish home in Palestine in 1937. As a result of an Arab rebellion. So the British didn't give the Jews a state. The Jews fought for that state and built the foundations of that state before it was created. All of the medical and labor and educational institutions that Israel has today, those were created before the state was created. And so, Palestinian leaders could do this too, but they choose not to. And there's a reason why. And, the feeling among Palestinians in 1928 and 1929, there actually wasn't really talk of an independent Palestine. At the time, it was this kind of pan-Arab movement. And so even the Grand Mufti himself, he didn't really speak about an independent Palestine. He spoke about, an Arab state. It wasn't necessarily going to be just Palestine. He actually spoke of Palestine being a part of Syria, because under the Ottomans, that's what it was. It was just a part of southern Syria. And as we discussed earlier, Palestine could have gained independence for the first time in its history in 1947 with the UN vote. There had never been an independent Palestine in the history of that region. So, it's really, when you think about what could have been, when you think about the 1947 UN vote if the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders had embraced that plan the way the Jewish leaders of Palestine did. We could have had a Jewish state and an Arab state. We could have had an Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace since 1947. And it's a shame more people don't know about that, because I think so much of the discourse since October 7th and before October 7th has been about this conflict beginning in 1948 with the creation of Israel. And that is just the most baffling and ahistoric argument to make. It's like starting your favorite television series at season 5. This conflict had been raging for decades before 1948. And, the creation of Israel in 1948, it didn't have to be just the creation of Israel. It could have been the creation of an independent Palestine as well. And the war that led up to 1948 and Israel's establishment didn't have to necessitate the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians who fled war. That war was declared by their leaders. And so it would be really beneficial to everyone involved if the people who are fighting for a free Palestine today would understand what has actually prevented a free Palestine, and that is not Israel.
I'm curious here. You talked about the motivations for the 1929 massacre as Haj Amin spread these rumors. If I were to ask someone, a Palestinian that maybe knows some history, I'm sure they would have a different story. How would they tell it? What was, they would say, absolutely not. We know this was going to happen, all these things. Or I don't know. I'm guessing what, and this is where it starts to become tricky, right? Because, I don't think there's ever a definitive history there maybe on some things, but not on everything. But yeah, I mean, tell us about, that kind of motivation into it. We can talk a little bit more about Black Sabbath, August 24th, 1929, and then August 27th and August 29th, and so on. But I think the important part here is, yes, you state in the book that there are these rumors that Jews were going to come and they're going to take over, and that they were just trying to protect, and so they had to deal with this. But I'm sure if I asked a Palestinian, they would have a totally different story. How do we make sense of this?
I'm so glad you asked that, because a really important way of looking at this conflict and this particular episode within this conflict, if you ask an Arab in Hebron about 1929, often they don't know about the riots, or if they do, they know it as the Al-Barak Rebellion. Al-Barak is the Arabic name for the Western Wall. So just a little more background on what the Western Wall is and the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam. It's the single holiest site for Muslims in Palestine and now Israel. But that mosque was built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed the second temple was destroyed about 1,000 years before the creation of Islam. And when that mosque was built there was still a Jewish presence in the Holy Land. I mean, the Jewish presence in that land goes back thousands of years, and there's always been a Jewish presence in that land. But under Muslim rule, Jews were forbidden from entering the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is the Jewish name, or the non-Muslim name for that site, because it's the site of the ancient Jewish temples, and there is no denying that is the site of the ancient Jewish temples. In fact, the Muslim Council, the Supreme Muslim Council, of which the Grand Mufti was the leader of, in English pamphlets for American and British tourists to Jerusalem, the site of Al-Aqsa was openly stated to be the site of the ancient temples. That was clearly explained in these pamphlets. But if you ask a Palestinian today, they'll tell you that there never was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, that it's all a lie, that it's a Zionist invention. Palestinians in Hebron often told me that all of the archaeological evidence of the ancient land of Israel is a Zionist lie. And so the reason it's called the Al-Barak Rebellion is because what the Mufti did was he convinced his people that the Jews who were praying at the Western Wall, which was the closest they could get to the Temple Mount, the Western Wall is the last remnant of the Second Temple. and Jews could only pray in this really cramped space at the Western Wall. And they would often be attacked, spat at, stones would be thrown at them, they would be cursed at, and they withstood this humiliation nonetheless, because this was the holiest place they could pray. And what he did was he convinced the Muslims that the Jews who were praying at the Western Wall weren't just praying there. They wanted to turn it into a synagogue, and then from there conquer Al-Aqsa to rebuild their ancient temple. And so when more and more Jews started to pray there and started to protest to the British against the British failure to protect them from increasing Muslim attacks, and those attacks were being carried out because of this disinformation campaign, it just ended up being this self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because he's telling his people, the Jews who are praying there don't just want to pray there, they want to take it over. And then the Jews are protesting to the British, you need to give us protection here, and you need to give us the right to pray in peace without worshippers being attacked by Muslims. And so those protests against the British then seem to play into the Mufti's hands. And after a year of suffering this disinformation campaign and these increasing attacks by Muslims against Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, finally on one of the the holiest days in the Jewish calendar, it takes place in August, in middle of 1929. It's called Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's when Jews commemorate the destruction of both of the Jewish temples in Jerusalem, which took place on the same date in the Jewish calendar. And 10,000 Jews prayed at the Western Wall that night on this holy day, and they were surrounded by a line of British forces to protect them from Muslims who would have wished to attack them. The day after those prayers, there was a much smaller group, about a few hundred Jews, who marched to the Western Wall to protest the British for failing to counter this disinformation campaign. They were chanting, "The wall is ours." And so this kind of nationalist, show of force by Jews in Jerusalem gave the Grand Mufti the proof he needed to say, look, we were right. They're chanting the wall is ours. They're chanting for more power. They're calling for more power over this holy site, which to Muslims was known as Al-Buraq, because it is also known as the place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven on a winged steed on his night journey. And so it had, some holiness to Muslims as well, but was not their holy site where they would pray. And so if you ask, if you would have asked an Arab in 1929 what's happened at the Western Wall, they would say, no, we're not, it's them who are attacking our holy site. It's them who are trying. It's the Jews who are trying to take over Al-Aqsa. They're the ones who are, who started this. And so you're right. If you ask different sides of any conflict, they're going to have, their own narrative about it. But the facts are that on August 23rd, 1929, those riots erupted not with a Jewish attack. They erupted with thousands of Muslim worshippers descending from Al-Aqsa down to the Western Wall and down to the Old City, where they beat Jewish passersby and set fire to Jewish businesses. And then from Jerusalem, those riots just spread to every Jewish community of Palestine. And between the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, with that Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, to 10 days later with the outburst of the riots, there had been attacks between the Jewish and Arab communities in Jerusalem because of this campaign of propaganda. So it was, Arabs trying to attack Jews for taking over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then Jews attacking Muslims in, retribution. So it was just this kind of cycle of violence that we see today, but, on a miniature scale.
Yeah. Yeah, that's complicated for sure. Okay, so let's talk about Haj Amin. Interesting. So here's the bit that was unbeknownst to me. Maybe other people know it, I'm sure. But you say in the book that after the massacre and throughout the 30s and into the 40s, Haj Amin embraced fascism, but also embraced Nazism. Okay, that's not great, obviously, but it goes further. And so he meets with Hitler, and the context is that my understanding of it, how you tell in the book, is that there's all these strange. I mean, Hitler had all these obviously bizarre ideas about an Aryan race and all this stuff, and I think you mentioned that Amin looks. I think he had kind of clear eyes, and he was kind of more fair skinned.
Blue eyes and kind of reddish hair.
Yeah,
light skinned. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess Hitler was was a little bit more open to that, I guess, than maybe others. But either way, he sees him as a kind of vessel to exterminate Jews in the region, and that how they could do things. I continue that part of the story because it's like, okay, this was a terrible time. Hitler had people over the world, etc. Where that goes afterwards is also kind of shocking for me. But yeah, how did that happen? How did he get all the way up to meeting with Hitler and kind of being his like proxy of sorts? I mean, that's just a wild story that you don't hear about that often. Like, tell us about that.
To be honest with you, that was one of the most shocking elements of my research for this book, because
it was for me reading it. I almost jumped off the page. I mean, there's a picture of them meeting together. I was like, holy shit, how did I not get any of this in like any history? Like, what in the world? Like, I just was like really wild for me.
Not just you. I've heard that from people all over where I've spoken about my book. And I myself, I had considered myself an expert in this conflict. I majored in foreign policy in the Middle East and took so many courses on the history of the conflict, the politics of the conflict, the history of Islam. And I had never learned, not only did I not learn much about the Grand Mufti, but nothing. And I had learned nothing about his role during the Holocaust. And he played a really outsized role for someone who was not German or European. For a Muslim leader, you can't really just call him a Nazi accomplice. He was a Nazi. He was based in Berlin throughout World War II, living in a Nazi finance estate. He led Joseph Goebbels' Arab branch of his Ministry of Propaganda. He issued Arabic radio broadcasts throughout the Muslim world of Nazi propaganda. And what was interesting listening to or reading the transcripts of those broadcasts was how he infused the Nazi propaganda with Islam. He would quote hadith from the Prophet Muhammad calling on Muslims to kill Jews wherever they are. Sadly, we see those same quotes from imams in the West Bank and Gaza and even within Israel today, in Jerusalem and at Al-Aqsa Mosque. There are imams who are using those same quotes from that hadith, from that saying of the Prophet that they should kill Jews wherever they are. And what's interesting is how the Grand Mufti kind of managed to flee prosecution wherever he turned. During his years as the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, he was appointed by the British. The British had essentially given him that position. And when he led a violent rebellion against the British in 1936, so even after the massacre of 1929, when they carried out this royal commission to investigate the causes of the riots, despite mountains of evidence that he had led to those riots, they pardoned him, allowed him to keep his post, and instead blamed the riots on that peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall. And then also after the rebellion he led in 1936, they again worked to appease him by abandoning the Balfour Declaration. It was only after that rebellion claimed the life of a British official did the British finally decide, okay, you know what? We've had enough of this guy. Let's arrest him. He managed to flee arrest, and he fled Palestine in disguise and went first to Beirut and then to Iraq, and then finally arrived in Berlin. And within a month of arriving in Berlin, he sat down with Hitler and had this 90-minute meeting with him. And you can read the transcript, the official German transcript of their conversation. I feature it in the book, but it's really just mind-blowing. I mean, he basically asks Hitler to bring his solution to Palestine to help him rid Palestine of the Jewish community, and he pledges his people's support for the Nazi cause. Because he's not representing himself; he's representing the Arabs of Palestine. And at that point, he was already one of the most prominent Arab leaders in all of the Arab world. And in Germany, during his time living in Berlin from 1941 to 1945, he was often referred to as the leader of the Arabs, the Führer of the Arabs. And he helped the Nazis recruit tens of thousands of Muslim fighters. And he was so effective in that role that when the Nazis were defeated and World War II came to an end, the UN placed the Grand Mufti on its list of Nazi war criminals. And yet, once again, he fled Berlin. He managed to seek refuge in France. The French did not give him up, even though the UN had wanted him for Nazi war crimes. I mean, the French were implicated in those war crimes themselves, so I guess there was some alliance there as well. But he went from France to Cairo, where he ended up meeting his young cousin Yasser Arafat, who would become his disciple, because the Grand Mufti was the first leader of the Palestinian people. Before the Grand Mufti, there was no, if you look up, leaders of the Palestinian people, you'll often find Arafat as the first leader of the Palestinian people, but Arafat was actually trained by the Grand Mufti, his older cousin. And so they met in Cairo, and then they both ended up moving to Beirut, where the Grand Mufti ended up dying of natural causes. He was never arrested for his role in the Holocaust. Many other Nazis were forced to live out their days under other names. They had to, flee prosecution, and they didn't get to lead an open life. The Grand Mufti did. He, lived an open life. After the Holocaust, he continued that jihad against the Jews of Palestine. And during the Holocaust, it wasn't just his work with the Nazi regime, actually, that was so horrible, but he also worked to convince independent European leaders to prevent the Jews who were fleeing those countries and fleeing the Holocaust and trying to get to Palestine. He worked to convince those European leaders to close their borders and send those Jewish refugees to Poland, because he had seen the concentration camps himself. He knew that if they went to Poland, they were not going to reach Palestine. Of course, after the Holocaust, many refugees from Eastern Europe did end up coming to Palestine, but not until the creation of Israel were those borders open. Under the British, as a result of that rebellion that the Grand Mufti led in 1936, the British put in place severe restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. And so tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazi persecution and then fleeing concentration camps ended up either being sent back to Europe by the British or detained in internment camps in Palestine and in Cyprus.
It's a wild, wild, wild sequence of events. The one thing I want to say here, just to kind of put a fine point on this, is Palestine essentially has had three leaders. You have Haj Amin, Arafat, and currently Abbas, I think, is the current leader. So when I read this, I said, well, okay, it's part of our history, some dark chapters, but that's done. That's over now. Now, I'm not going to say this or make this point, but you talk about in the book how he really groomed his relative Yasser Arafat. I mean, we all know Arafat. I mean, I can remember growing up and seeing all the things in media and things like that, and we all know who he is. But it was him to do the same things. I mean, you have this guy's a Nazi. He's grooming his relative Arafat to then lead the Palestinian people on Nazi propaganda, and including former Nazi officials to be part of the PLO. And so, Arafat is look, maybe there's a biography on Arafat himself. Okay, everyone's their own person, but you're not going to get groomed by someone and have this propaganda in your head and just be like, no, not such a great idea. And have Nazi officials and have all these things. And I think Arafat died in 04, 06, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've had Abbas there since. So, I mean, that's a wild connection to like modern day. Like we're talking the 21st century with still someone that was groomed by a Nazi. Like I don't want to put too fine of a point or make a correlation where there isn't one. But I mean, how do you see that kind of linkage if there is one there?
No, there's a direct line. I mean, you can't deny those facts. I mean, there were testimonies of also Arafat making Mein Kampf required reading for members of the PLO in the early days. And, Abbas, who took power immediately after Arafat's death, he has held on to power ever since. I mean, he's in his late 80s and still ruling his people who, overwhelmingly despise him. He's one of the least popular leaders in the world. And yet he too has a history of maybe not Nazism, but Holocaust denial, ironically, since his predecessors had a direct link to the Nazis, and the Grand Mufti saw with his own eyes the concentration camps where millions of Jews were exterminated. So Abbas, before he rose to power, his, as a younger man, his thesis, I think as a doctorate student or a master's student, included Holocaust denial. He wrote that the gas chambers were not, in fact, for mass extermination. He engaged in what many Holocaust deniers do, which is, question the numbers of Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. And he has engaged in that Holocaust denial, well, maybe not Holocaust denial, but Holocaust justification. As recently as 2023, he was involved in this firestorm over his comments at a conference. He was speaking in Arabic, and this is something that's interesting because often Palestinian leaders, when they're speaking in Arabic, the international community just doesn't pick up on it because it's not translated, but this speech was translated. And in this speech, he essentially justifies Hitler and the Holocaust by saying that it wasn't, anti-Semitism that fueled the Holocaust. It was the Jews' own actions and their own impact on society and their money lending. And because that speech was translated, he was criticized from across the international community. But I mean, he was just forced to apologize. And when you're saying things like that, an apology is not really enough because clearly he actually believes that. And that tells us a lot about what we're dealing with here. And I think it really explains a lot of the rhetoric we're seeing today. I mean, I don't know if you're privy to this on Twitter, but almost anyone speaking out in defense of Israel these days is branded a Zio-Nazi, a Zionist Nazi, and Israel's actions in Gaza are being compared to a Holocaust. And I think it's really interesting when you look at, the role that early Palestinian nationalists played in the actual Holocaust and the role that the Grand Mufti played in the Holocaust. Because I think people who are accused of something often try to shake off that criticism by directing those same criticisms at other people. And so, I think it's a really inconvenient truth for many in the anti-Israel kind of sector that the people, who are leading the early anti-Zionist movement were actually Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, these things start to become more and more connected and relevant for modern events. So many things I could keep asking, but I kind of, as we kind of finish here, I want to kind of bring us up to kind of current events, obviously, because as you said in the beginning, you were writing this during, right when October 7th happened. So a few things here. It's I mean, obviously tense to discuss for a lot of people. I think when we think about it this way, October 7th was horrific. I mean, it's horrific. And there are still Jewish hostages that haven't been freed or released.
Mm-hmm.
The arguments I hear are, I think people of good faith or some balanced folks will say, yep, fully agreed. That's all awful. But
Mm-hmm.
how can it be justifiable that Netanyahu and the political leaders in Israel are, I mean, right? Some people have used the term committing a genocide in Gaza, and how things have been with settlements and things like that in the West
Mm-hmm.
Bank, and how things are partitioned, and the color ID cards Palestinians have to use to move around, and they start talking about all these things, and it is a hard image to look at when you're seeing Israel military, flattening out whole neighborhoods and hospitals and refugee camps, and I've heard the arguments here about the Hamas has been doing this to their own people. They strategically put all underground underneath hospitals and schools and refugee camps. I've heard this,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not denying that, but
Mm-hmm.
it is. And again, the whole thing about numbers, is I think not always a helpful discussion. How many or how less, but
Mm-hmm.
it is hard. I think the loss of human life on anywhere, right? What happened on October 7th is horrific, and the way in which it was done I mean, that's the thing about your book is there are unfortunately some chilling comparisons. Unfortunately, I mean, it was wild reading it. It does not feel good though to see innocent Palestinians trapped, going hungry, and absolutely decimated in Gaza. It's a hard thing because I know Hamas has said every day is going to be October 7th until we eradicate Jews, and they have their proxies in Hezbollah, and then you get Iran. Like it's a complicated thing here. But as you're saying, the people have now done this sort of projection now that Israel and Jews are committing a genocide and Holocaust against Palestinians and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for you personally, and then I guess more generally, how do you think we navigate these kinds of conversations in a humane way that is acknowledging of the loss of life, on both sides of things, and try to make sense of how that doesn't have to happen anymore? How do we how do we navigate this?
Well, first of all, I'm also horrified, and horrified is an understatement. I mean, the scenes of Gaza destroyed are extremely depressing, and the amount of children who have been killed and innocent women who have been killed, it's horrible. I, like many Israelis, have wanted this war to end for a long time, but I think it's almost a mirror image of the peace process in a sense, because if you look at all of the negotiations for a peaceful resolution of this conflict, every time Israel has been, the one ready and open to, make concessions and offer the creation of, yes, a demilitarized Palestinian state, but that's, the first step. Like, of course, it's going to be a demilitarized Palestinian state at first, but, these arguments that, a demilitarized Palestinian state isn't really a Palestinian state, or, there weren't enough concessions. Okay, you can make that argument, but those offers of peace weren't rejected because there was an alternative that the Palestinian leadership presented instead. No, they were just rejected out of hand with no alternative presented. So you have the same thing happening right now with this war, because if you look at all of the ceasefire efforts that have been made, Israel's agreed to pretty much every one. Yes, it has had, conditions for agreeing to them, like, keeping some soldiers in certain areas to prevent Hamas from rearming, or to prevent Hamas from getting into certain areas where it needs to keep watch, or requiring that all of the hostages be turned over. These are innocent people who are being held in horrific conditions for over a year, including children and women. And Hamas has rejected every single ceasefire. Every single one. And their claim that there could have been a ceasefire from day one. No, their requirement for a ceasefire from the beginning was that Israel release all Palestinian prisoners from the prison system. This would set free thousands of Hamas members with blood on their hands. And you cannot, how would Israel agree to do that? I mean, what country would agree to do that, to set free members of the very terrorist organization that had just carried out the most horrific attack on its soil? So that wasn't their only condition. Their condition was also remaining in power. The Palestinian people in Gaza do not want Hamas to remain in power. They know that Hamas brought this upon them. And, it's really interesting because I remember in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, people who were justifying the massacre in the West, white people justifying what had just happened to the Jews in southern Israel, saying, oh, well, what do you expect? It was an open-air prison. It was a concentration camp. And yet, if you look at what Palestinians are saying since October 7th, they're uploading videos on social media showing what their houses and communities looked like before October 7th. Those images do not show an open-air prison or a concentration camp. They show a beautiful place. I mean, Gaza sits on the Mediterranean. It could have been a beautiful territory. And instead, Hamas turned it into this massive urban weapon of war where almost every building was booby-trapped when the IDF went in. Almost every residential home had weapons in it, had tunnel shafts built into it. I'm not saying that the people living in those homes agree to that, because they couldn't disagree. They had no way of standing up to Hamas because they could be executed or tortured or imprisoned. But I mean, the Hamas itself weaponized its own people. And since October 7th, Hamas's own leaders have said that they're willing to sacrifice as many Palestinian lives as it will take to liberate Palestine, which means to destroy Israel. So I think that it's so important for people to understand that if they actually want to see Palestinians living a life of freedom and liberty, that can't happen with Hamas. Hamas doesn't want that. And they have made that very clear in their own words. And I think that people have this willful ignorance when it comes to Hamas and when it comes to the conflict of not really listening to what these people are actually saying themselves. These Hamas leaders who are not even living in Gaza and whose children aren't living in Gaza, they're saying, the Palestinian people are known for making sacrifices for our land. Well, it's very convenient for them that, it's the Palestinian people living in Gaza, not the ones who are living abroad, that are making those sacrifices. And I think it's also really interesting that Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza, has not granted asylum or citizenship to Palestinians for decades, and including after October 7th. After October 7th, Egypt sealed its borders with Gaza and did not allow anyone to come into Egypt unless they paid bribes of around $10,000 a person. So it's not that they wouldn't let them get there. It was that they'll let them go there only if they are super wealthy or extremely connected. And I think that, a lot of the people protesting against the war really don't know much about this conflict and the actual forces behind it and the history behind it. And people try to argue that, when you start to bring up that history, they say, oh, why are you justifying a genocide? Nobody's trying to justify anything here. We're just saying that, if you want to resolve this conflict, it's not going to help if you know nothing about it. And if you don't know the actual sources of this conflict, because you can't solve a problem without understanding it. And I think so many people have such a warped understanding of what this conflict really is about.
Yeah, I would agree that I think anybody looking from the outside in, so anyone that's not there in the region or hasn't been there, if they're honest, they'll admit that it's a complicated issue, and at the very least, and unfortunately, innocent human lives are caught in the middle. And I think one of the nice things, whether people agree with you or disagree with you, is irrelevant because you wrote a fantastic book that roots some of the conflict in history, but also gives a wider lens of context of many things. Some of the things we discussed. Of look, this stuff has ripple effects here, and we're seeing some of those ripples. So, in that way, you've just done fabulous work with your book, and I can't say enough thanks for you coming on and being so gracious with your time and wisdom. And so, big thanks.
Thank you so much. I think one thing I would really like to add is that people who really do want to see peace in Israel and Palestine, and people who do support the Palestinian people should be supporting the peace seekers and the moderates among the Palestinian population and not actors like Hamas, because Hamas will only bring more death and destruction upon the Palestinian people. They don't hide that. And yet there are voices within Palestinian society that urgently need uplifting. And I think more resources need to be put into a future where those voices seeking peace and coexistence don't have to fear for their lives, because the situation now is that if you speak out, if you're a Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank and you speak out against Hamas and you speak out for a peaceful resolution of this conflict and, dare I say, a two-state solution, if you're a Palestinian speaking out for that, you have to fear for your life if you're going to speak openly about that. And so long as that is the case, we're never going to see peace. And so, right now, the loudest voices for peace in Palestinian society don't live in the West Bank or Gaza. They live in the US, they live in Britain, because they've had to flee for their lives. So those people need to be empowered, and they need to be empowered to help their equivalents that are still living in the West Bank and Gaza to be able to speak out openly.
Yeah, I firmly agree with you on that. I think that's really, really, really essential and important. And so uplifting those voices is tremendous, of tremendous importance. So big thanks. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Javier. It was really a pleasure.